Hi, today I'm going to be exploring some of the drawing that I do. So I'm going to set up a still life which has some elements of just the tonal values. So there's going to be no colour in there, well, apart from a very tiny bit of lemon. Now, when I'm doing it, I'm going to be talking all the way through it because I think it just helps whilst I'm actually doing the subject to explain what's going on at the same time. So I hope you enjoy it, and yeah, if you like it, subscribe, and yeah, thank you very much for watching. So here we are at the drawing board. I've got all my tools and implements ready for this challenge, which is a classic still life. There's 3 objects. Well, it's actually 4, 5 if you count the teapot lid, but they're all a very simple composition in effect, and something which I chose which had a bit of perspective in it, and so that it wasn't so sort of amorphous, like it was organic. These objects have a structure, and you can see reflections and lines and all sorts of shading and different relationships with them. So what I've done is I've started mapping out and finding the points of reference and distances, which is why I've got this ruler with me, so that basically I can look at the object that I'm drawing, and in this case I'm doubling the measurement of what I see. Now, if you use classic sort of perspective, you want to isolate some of these items and then look at angles in which you want to draw them. So for instance, over here, this angle here on the edge of this particular piece of mat here is an angle that I've used by looking at the angle that my pencil falls on whilst following the line of it, and then just placing the same line in the drawing by doing that. Similarly, relationships where there aren't any straight lines, like the curvature of this, I've just imagined that it was flat, and I've measured it across and then doubled it onto the paper, making points of reference. Now, one of the things that's quite abundant in this particular composition is ellipses. There's at least 4, 5, 6 of them, 7, 8, 9, 10, and multiplying. And they are particularly tricky. What you have to remember about looking at an ellipse from an angle is that there are no corners on ellipses. They are actually round. So it would be very, very tempting, for instance, to make where the ellipse comes round here some sort of corner at the edge where another line meets it going round the other way. But if you look very carefully, of course it's just a flattened circle. So your pencil will have to kind of keep going round and round and round until you find the right ellipse. And when you've been doing it for a little while, of course those things come a little bit easier, but in effect what we're looking at here are a series of circles flattened off. So I'm looking at this interior one here, and I'm seeing a beautiful circular shape here. So I'm going to try and emulate what I see there. That's that curvature there is what I'm actually seeing on the interior. Now in this part here it's incredibly dark, and this is probably one of the darkest areas in the whole composition. So if I'm going to start anywhere on this, I would generally start here so that I can actually deepen this to the very darkest tone, because my paper's white, and in effect I've got white. Some of my brightest areas of white are like here, this flash across the top of the teapot there, and another one on the side of this. When the light hits this dark area, of course, it forms a very light area, but it's not the lightest. If you look at the two values here, you can see the difference between this much duller, although it's a flash of light, it is in fact grey, whereas this has got to be my very brightest white, which is the value of the paper. Or if I was going to use anything at all, it would be a white pencil. However, this white pencil, when you put it onto this white paper, and I might be able to demonstrate, doesn't have very much effect at all. So this really won't be giving you very much ability to go from dark back to light once you've made it light, which of course is why we have a rubber. Lots of artists hate these things. There's lots of different types of rubber. This one is your classic sort of rubberized rubber, and this horrible gnarly thing here is a putty rubber. Now putty rubbers usually take off charcoal, which is this stuff, whilst these kinds of rubberized rubbers take off graphite pencil. So we have lots and lots of different tools in here with which we can start to explore some of these darker areas. Now I can use charcoal on here because I know that I've got a putty rubber with which to rub it out, but I have here also some pastel, very dark pastel. Now this won't rub off in any shape or form. This will stain the paper, so you have to be pretty sure that the dark that you're going to want to put on, you don't want to take off. But I'm going to be using graphite on this because for this particular exercise I want to go as far as I can with pencil and see what values I can make. So I'm starting in with this very dark area here, and I'm giving it a bit of a shading, and this will help me to see where I'm going. This is the pestle here. This is known as a mortar and pestle, in case you were unaware of that. And along the side of that there is a very bright area, so I'm going to whip back in with the rubber and just take that away so that I can see where I'm going and what's happening. Well, I've just realised because I'm right-handed, the camera was in the way of whatever I was doing there, so I've moved the camera so that you can now see from this side where my arm is not going to be obscuring this side of the paper. And lots of people hold their pencils, you know, quite close to the edge and start drawing like really densely and actually quite strongly with a lot of pressure onto the paper, but at this particular juncture I'm moving my pencil a lot further down from my end of my fingers. It gives me a lot more range to be able to move the stroke a lot more fluidly, and therefore I'm going to be exploring some of this with these tones as we come round. And just underneath this pestle is another very strong dark tone, so I'm going to add that in and explore and express that right to the edge of this bowl here, which is in fact called the mortar, and adding directional stroke in the direction of the actual object as it's sitting inside the bowl there. Now there again we've got some much more dark tones coming in. Don't forget to leave as much light as you possibly can where it exists in what you see, because although you do have a rubber, it is nice to try and get it right the first time. Now this is actually leaning on this bowl here, and at this point it has a very dark piece coming up here, and there are some amazing sort of reflections and reflected light in there, just very subtly. And along here at that juncture is another shadow which is coming in from the window over there. So we've got some fairly good natural light going on here, but at the same time I've got an overhead light, so that I've got two sources of light, one from the window and one directly overhead. So I'm hoping that as I'm drawing this, you might begin to believe what you're actually seeing in front of me, which, now that isn't leaning on there, so I'm going to have to make some adjustments, and that I think is now understandably leaning on the edge. Now there's another really dark patch coming round here which defines the side of this, so I'm giving that some really dark strokes to be able to describe the actual object in front of me. Now something happens here where I can see that the pestle has a very dark piece on the top there, just to describe the round. So as you can see, some of the lines that I've drawn actually don't really get incorporated into the drawing at all. They become part of the actual shading, and this is why drawing is so interesting, is because actually you can describe things without actually using any lines. You can actually make marks that reflect the surface of what you're drawing. So in this case, because it's a fairly mottled surface, I think it's made out of some sort of a marble, it's got a fairly sort of speckled surface, so I'm making it as much of a sort of texture as I can, and then deepening and darkening the areas where the light's falling. So that's fine for that relationship. I wouldn't want to do too much more to something like this now, because I want to make sure that I relate it to other things and tones that are in the rest of the drawing. So I'm going to leave that area and then move on to the next part, which is probably the lemon. Okay, so I'm looking at this lemon, and I'm just shutting one eye and drawing the ellipse in space where the lemon is. Now that kind of gives me a rhythm for that ellipse, so I'm going to try and just do that where the lemon is on the paper. Now obviously there's loads and loads of lines there, and in fact I need to really choose one of them now, so I'm going to take my pencil and just make that ellipse like that. Now that circle is facing that way slightly, and of course the edge of the lemon is around this way here. Now this is a point where there is a corner where one ellipse, the back of the lemon, meets the front surface of the ellipse. And interestingly, in this I'm seeing that the centre of the lemon is not actually completely the centre of that ellipse, it's somewhere about there. And then from there, that radial space, you can start to draw the lines that make up the segments, some of which have lines that are slightly longer than others. I'm not sure how many segments there are in a lemon. I wonder if it's always the same, but in this case I'm just drawing the main ones so I've got a reference of where they are. And I'm noticing that the segments then form rounds within inside the space of the ellipse. So I'm going to exaggerate those and that helps me find the right spaces and sizes for that. And of course there's the rind on the outside, which I have to find. Sometimes it's thinner in places and thicker in others, and there. So I'm then just checking that the relationship between the mortar and pestle and the lemon is correct, and then I'm going to find where the teapot starts to emerge from the lemon, if you can imagine that, and that wonderful curved line that then comes right the way over the top. And thought, oh, there's another tiny ellipse in there, and this one is really small but very important. And then the edge on the other side of the teapot spout, the line comes down like that, meets the side of the teapot, goes up towards the lid. Now at this point I can see that something is slightly wrong about the pre-measurements that I made, and I might have to just move my teapot ellipse lid slightly further to the left, because that distance there, if I measure it with my trusty ruler in proportion, is only the same size as the ellipse on the left. But if I try and measure it in proportion to my lemon, it's a third larger again. Sounds all very mathematical, I know, but once you've got some of these measurements going, you will be very pleased that you did, because it makes the rest of the drawing so much more exacting. So I think that this handle here is now completely in the wrong place, but not is all lost, because I can then rub out some of the lines that I've got and make sure that I'm moving in the right direction with the drawing. A couple of negative spaces to check will be this one underneath this wonderful teapot spout, which is the side of the mortar here, and this wonderful shape here, which forms the second layer of the mortar. So this negative space inside between the lemon, the teapot and the mortar is a very particular shape, and one that will make this drawing much easier to follow whilst I'm drawing it. So, sorry, I'm going slightly quiet at the moment because I'm just concentrating on getting the bottom of this in the right shape. Now, it's always very useful to stand back from what you're doing every now and then, just to make sure that everything's going okay and everything's in proportion. And at the moment, I'm having a bit of a mare over on the right hand side here, because you can still see the handle from a point at which I'd measured, and I don't think it's correct. Now, I'm just making reference to other places within the drawing so that I can make sure that I have the right angles and the right shapes to proceed. Now this comes right in like that, And at this point I notice that the top of the handle of the teapot here, okay, it's quite narrow there, and then what I can see is quite large, and it looks like it forms like a ribbon going round that way. But of course this point here is something that in foreshortening and in space I'm going to have to use proper shading to describe. So right at the top of the handle there to this point here, it looks like we can see only the top of the teapot here, but then here you can see the inside of the handle, and it goes down there. So I have to describe this point where it changes, and you can see the outside to the inside. It's something phenomenal about 2 dimensions, drawing from 3 dimensions, where you're actually describing something that's flattened off, but when you're drawing it you're trying to describe it in 3 dimensions. And at this point the teapot comes completely round and comes back to the lemon here, and it's quite a round ellipse that we're drawing. Now here there's quite a lot of shading to be had on the bottom of the teapot spout, and down here underneath the lemon that's quite dark as well. And then of course we have the most fascinating things, which most people don't really see all that often unless they're drawing, and that's the shadows that are made by any objects that you're drawing, and the spaces between the shadow and the object and reflected light. So I can actually see inside this shadow here a section where it's actually quite a lot lighter, and this helps to describe the actual physical nature of the object itself. Its shadow insinuates that it has a volume. Now when I'm drawing I often think, oh, there are no such things as lines, it's just where one surface meets another, it's not a line. But of course when you're drawing as opposed to painting, lines are quite important because they define one area from another. In painting of course you just put one colour next to another, and the change between one and the other is quite distinct. But of course in this particular exercise I'm trying to describe what I'm seeing, so lines do become important, and they're areas where one tone or one area of dark meets an area of light. Now here the side of this teapot doesn't have a line, however it does have an area of a different tone, and again I'm going to push my fingers further down the pencil so that I get longer, more ability to describe the area that I'm drawing in strokes. Now interestingly of course this teapot lid with its little knobby handle has moved a little bit over to the right, because when I drew it initially and I measured it, I made it go there, so I'm going to have to move it, and it is going to be right in the centre of this of course, and it's approximately there. Now this beautiful circular volume on the top there with a wonderful under reflection, so I'm going to describe it like this, and just here underneath it is another beautiful reflection, shadow I mean, and over the top there has a little amount of shading, but the darkest area, of course, is in the middle of it, to be able to correctly describe it. So we're just going to demonstrate what you might do in order to be able to describe how white that is on the top. So I'm going to give it another shading on the outside very quickly, so that it describes the positive shape on the outside. I give it a bit of a smudge so you can see what I'm talking about. You can then make sure that your highlights are very, very white by describing what's on the outside of it. And most drawings and paintings indeed rely on the fact that you're using something in the background in order to be able to describe something that's there. So in this case, instead of actually drawing a line there, I've made the top of the teapot very light from the description of the surround in the background. And you can add and put in as much light as you require, and add various sort of tones. Now here on this side of the teapot we have some very interesting reflected areas. In fact, I think it's reflecting me and the paper, and so there's a kind of square shape inside it of my paper. Now that, when you're drawing something like this, is always really interesting, because it shows how much you're observing what you're seeing, and you can describe all kinds and all manners of things in things like glass and ceramic, very shiny polished ceramic like this. Also on the lid we have some exquisite shadows along with that wonderful lightning flash that you see along there. So always remember to keep that as the very lightest area, along with the top and this, as you're drawing it. I hope you enjoyed watching all of that demonstration of my drawing. In the end, the end product wasn't quite as dramatic as I expected it to be, but I hope that the process was well explained. So in conclusion, if you want to ask me any questions or you've got any inquiries, please do get in contact with me and I'll be very happy to help. Thanks for watching.